It's great to be here with so many friends. Many of the companies that you all represent, the Conservation Fund has had the privilege of working with over the last 26 years. We've had especially long and strong relationships with our two co-chairs, R.R. Donnelly and, of course, the National Geographic Society. In fact, Hans, early in my career, I was detailed to the National Geographic Society for almost 4 years to work on a society-wide initiative on fresh water. And the two status symbols at the Geographic, I had my own cubicle and my own parking space. And those were indeed heady days. You'd walk around the halls. I often remarked that it was the only building that I'd ever been in where I enjoyed getting lost, because every hall had these magnificent photographs that would take you back to some other place in the world. You'd turn a corner and you'd bump into Jane Goodall, or you'd sit down to lunch and Richard Leakey would be sitting there. I thought, well, this is pretty tall cotton, and it's tough to peak in one's career so early. It's been a downhill slide since getting my own parking space, but fortunately the Conservation Fund has been gracious enough to keep me around. And as Hans said, the fund is an interesting and unique institution in the United States. In addition to saving land, we're the only organization in the country that is chartered for both conservation, mostly land conservation, and economic development and job creation. In fact, we were created to work at the interface of business and environment, balancing economic and environmental objectives. For 27 years now, we have pursued that agenda across the United States. We just work domestically, but we work in all 50 states. And for the last 11 years, we've been the top-rated environmental charity in the United States, as ranked by Charity Navigator and the American Institute of Philanthropy. Indeed, we've protected more than 7 million acres of land, including, and this is important, we now own and operate over 160,000 acres of working forest. If you believe that you are operating at that interface of business and environment, you ought to have some skin in the game when you think about changing an industry or making recommendations on how others in the industry should change their behaviors. And so we own and operate 160,000 acres of land. It's all in the tax rolls. We harvest all 160,000 acres. We know all of the pain and suffering that goes along with being a timberland owner, but it gives us a unique insight into sustainable forestry and has allowed us, I think, to partner with organizations such as yours and others in the forest products industry in a way that other nonprofits have not. Working forests, as some of you may know, have not always been an easy fit in the environmental movement. It wasn't that long ago that harvesting trees was considered a bad activity, that working forests were considered some less than ultimate conservation outcome. Back in 1999, when we completed what remains today the largest forest conservation, multi-state forest conservation deal in the history of the United States, it was 300,000 acres in New York, New Hampshire, and Vermont. In fact, we were pilloried by the environmental community and by the foundations that supported them. They simply did not believe that working forests were an appropriate outcome for a conservation or environmental organization to pursue. Of course, we had a different view, and we put $86 million of our own money on the table to buy these lands. We managed them for some time and ultimately placed conservation easements on all 300,000 acres, and then recycled 2/3 of that land, 200,000 acres, back into the private sector, subject to very strong conservation easements. And it was then that the environmental community writ large across the country, I think, began to change its outlook, its perspective on sustainable forestry. Because not only were those lands permanently protected at a time when we were just beginning to lose vast acres of land, particularly across the northern tier of New England and New York, but the jobs, the communities that were dependent upon those forest lands remained as vital and vibrant entities. And the picture began to change. I think it has changed dramatically since then. Certification has played a very strong role. You all have played a strong role, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But clearly we have more work to do. Even in my own office, we have young people who come to work at the Conservation Fund, and one of the first things they request is that we go paperless. It's a common phrase, right? We should save the environment, go paperless. Clearly, they don't understand the direct connection between robust markets for forest products and the willingness and ability of landowners to keep forests as forests. Just this morning, I learned that Google is now getting behind the concept that if you use Google, you'll save trees. Use Google, save trees. It's absurd. It shows such a complete lack of understanding of what's going on in the forest and with those who own the forest. All Google is doing by promulgating that concept is accelerating the loss of forests in this country and elsewhere, the conversion of productive lands to non-productive uses, houses and shopping centers. You see, our inability to clearly articulate the importance of working forests and what it takes to maintain them, that's at the heart of our collective failure to align policies and practices toward ensuring that in this country our nation's working forests remain forests. Advocacy for working forests is as fractured as a mirror that has just fallen off the wall and broken into thousands of pieces, and frankly with just as many sharp edges. And the result is that forests are shrinking. Hans quoted you some statistics internationally, but here in this country, from the remote backwoods to groves near small towns, 35 acres here, 500 acres there, we are losing a forest. The decline is so incremental that at times it masks a crisis. But you wake up one morning and the forest you took for granted has bulldozers tearing up the trees. We've lost 13 million acres since 1992 in this country. Another 23 million acres or more projected to be lost by the middle of this century. We lose over 1.5 million acres each and every year. The pace of the losses is staggering, and the current economic downturn certainly is no cure. America continues to add 2.7 million people each and every year. By the turn of the century, we're expected to reach 600 million. Already, we lose over 1 million acres of forest land, and the needs of these new Americans as they take up residence, as they join the workforce, as they enter into our educational institutions, the demands of these new Americans will place even greater stress on what forests remain. I believe we need a new narrative in this country about forests. We need to inject some urgency into the development of this new narrative. And yet, this too is not without pitfalls. We must be thoughtful about the words that we choose when we talk about forests. We must be careful in how we frame our argument, because that is what will make all the difference to those whom we want to hear our new message. Those of you in the printing business who deal in the industry of words and pictures, you know that words matter. And to illustrate, let me tell you a little story. You see, once upon a time there was a lady right here in Washington, D.C. She was rather old-fashioned, always quite delicate and elegant, especially in her language. And last winter, she and her husband were planning a week's vacation in the Deep South. So she wrote to a particular campground asking for a reservation. She wanted to make sure the campground was fully equipped, but didn't quite know how to ask about the toilet facilities. She just couldn't bring herself to write the word toilet in her letter. And after much deliberation, she finally came up with the old-fashioned term bathroom commode. But when she wrote that down, she still thought she was being a little too forward. So she started all over again, rewrote the entire letter, referring to the bathroom commode merely as the BC. Does the campground have its own BC? Is what she actually wrote. Well, the campground owner wasn't old-fashioned at all, and when he got the letter, he just couldn't figure out what the woman was talking about. The BC business really stumped him. After worrying about it for a while, the campground owner finally came to the conclusion that the lady must be asking about the local Baptist church. So he sat down and he wrote the following reply. Dear Madam, I regret very much the delay in answering your letter, but I now take pleasure in informing you that a BC is located 9 miles north of the campground and is capable of seating 250 people at a time. I admit it is quite a distance away if you're in the habit of going regularly. But no doubt you'll be pleased to know that a great number of people take their lunches along and make a day of it. They usually arrive early and stay late. The last time my wife and I went was 6 years ago, and it was so crowded we had to stand up the whole time we were there. It may interest you to know that right now a supper is planned to raise money to buy more seats. They're going to hold it in the basement of the BC. I would like to say it pains me very much not to be able to go more regularly. But it surely is no lack of desire on my part. As we grow old, it seems to be more of an effort, particularly in cold weather. If you do decide to come down to our campground, perhaps I could go with you the first time, sit with you, and introduce you to all the other folks. This is a very friendly community. That's a true story. As I said, words matter. And today, what I'd like to do is propose a new way of talking about forests that I hope will help to elevate forests to a much higher level of discourse when it comes to policy decisions, funding, and citizen support. We are winning battles here and there, but we are losing the war in this country, and we need a new narrative. And here it is. Forests as infrastructure. Forests as infrastructure. Not forests as wilderness, not forests as parks, not forests as sanctuaries for wildlife, or forests for recreation, not even forests as fiber supply, but forests as infrastructure.